Both these historiographies, if that's what they are, I'm calling them historiographies, I'm calling them histories, they have their blind spots. The scientists, if you read them, don't say anything about capitalism. And if you read James Hansen or David Archer, they actually have a faith in a rational public. Archer said it several times that if I can only speak about the heads of the special interest lobbies to the general public of America, the public would put pressure on the president or the government to make changes. And one may well ask of these scientists, why name humanity as the culprit behind anthropologic global warming? And the chapter in Hansen's book is called The Faustian Bargain, Humanity's Own Trap. When we know that most people in the world are poor, and the Faustian bargain on this question was struck by the fossil fuel interests and by those who sought to profit from industrialization of farming and livestock. We did not all voluntarily sign on to the pact, so why not speak of capitalism and its unsustainable models? While there is some justice to this retort, Hansen and Archer could come back with the legitimate reply that the activities of the capitalists themselves do not fully explain why their desire to sell cars or gas becomes our demand for exactly those very commodities. Demands that are actually shared by the upper and the upwardly mobile classes of India and China. So actually, if India and China, if development had really been even in the world, we would have reached a point of crisis much sooner. The only reason why we do not have as much greenhouse gas out there as we might have is because most people in the world are poor, and the poor don't emit as much greenhouse gas as the rich do. So if we do not think through a theory of capitalist conspiracy, the success of capitalism over other models of development is itself a complex problem that cannot be explained by staying simply within the narrative of capitalism. So I'm saying the people who tell the story of unequal relations between nations they stay within this story. And I'm saying the story of capitalism cannot be explained by that story itself. One has to move out of that story to explain why capitalism appeals to people. But nevertheless, it remains a fact that climatologists active in public discussions appeal to an underspecified idea of public or humanity. The real elephant in the room, it seems to me, for those taking the climate justice position, is the question of population, which is what is hidden in the per capita question. And it's clear that the rise of population in India and China, which both retrospectively and prospectively is a problem for the climate crisis, cannot be laid at the door of capitalism in a straightforward sense. Most growth in Indian population took place after independence, when India basically had an autarkic national economy cut off from the world economy in substantial ways. China, for good or bad, followed a socialist path of modernization. Population growth had to do with modernization, had to do with poverty, but it's very hard to blame it on unequal relations between nations in any straightforward sense. So it seems to me then that population has to be explained in a more complex way than simply by a story of capitalism that will connect climate change, population, in one narrative. So my position then is that the story of imperialism or Western expansion, the story of global capital, is thus a necessary part of the story of global warming, but it is not sufficient by itself to give us a full historical perspective on the nature of the crisis that human beings face. It has to be supplemented by histories being told by climate and earth scientists and by the specialists of evolution, stories that span much larger and somewhat, as I said, somewhat immiscible timescales. Usually in telling human stories, we safely ignore what's happening on the geological level. I mean, we can talk about geological developments through human experience, like a catastrophe happens. We can write the story of how humans respond to it. But generally these, what's called deep history of human evolution or geological history and what's called recorded history are kept separate, except in books like the one that Dan Smith wrote a few years ago on deep history and brain. We usually treat them both as sites of deep history we think of as natural history. Human history we think of as history in which the human timescale matters. Anthropogenic climate change brings into view not only the dynamic of resource and energy use in the history of capitalist modernity, but also questions about how this dynamic interacts with the geology of the planet, with our having become the dominant species on it. We need to think these histories together. So I'm kind of thinking that we really need to think this very large-scale history, like the geologic, evolutionary history of life on this planet, and the history of capitalism together. Now, this is where I totally agree with Gabriel. You might ask me, how do we think this together? Well, I don't have a simple answer to it. But I feel the need to think this together. But in principle, I can say that while, partly we don't know how to think this together because we haven't thought them together. Usually we don't read into those areas to write the histories that we want to write. But in principle, it seems to me that what I'm suggesting is not all that different from conceptualizing the history of, say, a complicated case of childbirth. Whereas a historian, you might need to think simultaneously of the unique medical history, biography of a human being, histories of institutions and practices, and at the same time, think about the evolutionary history of the pelvis of the human female. And the childbirth is an event that brings all these different histories together in an interesting and complicated way. Now that does not mean that we have to become researchers and experts in every single subfield mentioned, but our historical imagination needs to be informed by them, by this act of thinking on multiple scales together. And this has implications for how we teach and theorize history. And before I come to the second section, where I want to talk about the question of human agency, one of the most interesting responses to climate change that I've seen on the part of historians is model syllabus, a module of a syllabus produced recently by a group of historians who came together at the University of Southampton in England. And they've created a very interesting syllabus for teaching climate change and history to undergraduate students. And I'll come back to this syllabus at the end of my talk, because in that syllabus, which I completely admire, what they do, they end up again folding the whole crisis back into histories of modernity, which is kind of a version of the imperial history or the known familiar history of unequal relations between nations that I was talking about. To me, it seems that if we do a mental experiment, something like what Bruno Latour would do, you take these two histories. One is the history of unequal relations between nations, which has its points and its blind spots. The other is the history that climate scientists are telling. And you ask them, you think of these as two as large historical statements, and you ask yourself, how do they persuade? How do they persuade us? Then one could say that a historical statement normally persuades us by a combination of what you might call explanation and understanding. Now, the simple point I'm making here is this, that in writing human history, we don't simply explain events. We of course do explain events. We do causal relationships between events. We connect different events together. But we try to, what makes history into a humanist enterprise is that we try to be open to the experience of human beings in some other time and place. And again, we do it as an everyday, we do it as workaday historians every day, but there's a very fundamental philosophical basis to it, which is in phenomenology. And there's a lovely explanation of it, not only in Ricker's recent book, but in the philosopher Gadamar's book, Truth and Method, where in the discussion on Ranker and the section on history writing, he actually says that what fundamentally operates in history, particularly in the humanist version of history, the kind of history that Dilthey would have talked about, is that my own individual capacity to experience the world makes me open to the